Okay, so hopefully you have already watched the Understanding the Unit Circle video, and we are going to go ahead and just talk about the quadrants and how to find those quadrants. So when we're going through and drawing these, there are two different ways. This is going to be 0, 90, 180 degrees, 270 degrees, and 0 is also 360 degrees. Now, if we do this in radians, this is still 0. Now notice that 0 doesn't have the symbol on top of it. Then you have pi over 2. This is pi. This is 3 pi over 2. And finally, 2 pi. Now, when we're talking about the quadrants, everything in quadrant 1 is here. Everything in quadrant 2, quadrant 3, and quadrant 4. So if I want to go ahead and start with my first angle, let's say I have angle, and that is 27 degrees. That angle in standard form starts here at 0, goes up 27 degrees, and then that would be my angle. Now, let's say I had an angle that was negative 100 degrees. This is going in the opposite direction. I am still going ahead and starting at here, at 0, but I'm going negative 100, so I'm going in the opposite direction. Each quadrant is 90, so that gives me 90, so it's just a 10 more, so it's a little bit more. So this piece here would be negative 100 degrees. Now, I also have another way to name that, and if I want to name that angle with positive, the formula for what you do here is always, in this case I'm in degrees, so it's going to be 360 plus whatever that negative value is, that negative 100. So that goes ahead and gives you the fact that this is going to be also 260 degrees, which matches up perfectly because this little tiny piece here, right inside there, is 10. Because all of the fourth quadrant over there is 90 degrees. So this angle ends up in the third quadrant. If it was a larger angle, let's say it was 500 degrees, that just means you have to go around the circle a couple of different times. I still start at the same place. Going around this once, that gives me 360. So I've taken 360 away. So let's find out how much more I have to go through and do. So go ahead and subtract 360 from that. And that gives me 140 degrees. So I go from here. This gives me 90. So this will be my final portion of the angle. I already went 90 degrees, so I only need to go 50 more to go ahead and get 140, because that's 90 plus my 50. So this will be my terminal side of my angle, and that is either 500 degrees or 140 degrees. And that angle is in quadrant 2. Alright, so to do the same thing but with radians, you have to kind of know a little bit about fractions when you're working with this. So let's say I'm looking for pi over 5. Now that's not one of our smallest angles, that in one of the angles that we're given in the unit circle, but I know that pi over 5 is in between 0 and pi over 2. So pi over 5 is going to be up here, and pi over 5 is in the first quadrant. Now what if it's 5 pi over 3? So it might help for you guys to think about this as far as in terms of figuring out where it is in which quadrant, is to think about this in decimals. Pi over 2 is the same thing as pi. This is 1 pi. 3 divided by 2 here. 3 divided by 2 is going to equal 1.5 pi. And if I come back over here, what is 5 over 3 in terms of a decimal? Well, 5 over 3 is approximately 1.6. So I know it's going to be a little bit larger than 3 pi over 2. Now, let's go through and draw that angle. So that goes in and comes here. This is going to be in my fourth quadrant, and this is 5 pi over 3. So what if you have an angle that's larger than 2 pi? So let's say I have 8 over 3 pi. Now I know that's larger than 2 pi because twice 3 is 6. So I know that that's larger than 2 pi. So the first thing I'm going to go through and do with this is go all the way around my unit circle, and that is at 2 pi. So now to find the rest of that angle, how much further do I go? I do 8 over 3 pi minus 2 pi. Now I have to find a common denominator here. So I multiply the top and the bottom by 3 over 3. And now I'm left with 8/3 pi minus 6/3 pi. Notice, why did I do that? Because 6 over 3 is the same thing as 2. And now I go ahead and 8 minus 6 gives me 2/3 pi. 2/3 is more than 1/2. So I'm going to go ahead and keep going up all the way over here. And then my final angle ending point will be right there. And that is in quadrant number 2. So the last thing I want to do with you today is to go from degrees to radians and back to degrees. So we know that 360 degrees is equal to the entire circle, which is 2 pi. But I also know that 180 degrees is equal to pi. And this is the ratio that I'm going to use when I'm doing this. So this is true because 1 over 1 is always true, that I can have 180 degrees over pi, or I can multiply by pi over 180 degrees. It depends on what you have and what you want. So if I go ahead and start, let's say I have 140 degrees. Because degrees is in the numerator, I want to make sure I get rid of the degrees by putting that in the denominator. So I multiply that times pi over 180. Those degrees will cancel out, and I just have 140 over 180 pi. Then I just go through and reduce that, and that gives me 7/9 pi. So that is going from degrees to radians. Now to do it the opposite way, let's say I have pi over 7. I want to use the opposite ratio, and this time I want to use 180 degrees over pi. The idea behind this is I'm going to cancel out those pi's, and then I'm just going to be left with 180 degrees divided by 7, which is equal to 25.7 degrees.